Hello, my name is Deepshika Das, and I'm going to explain a solution to Homework 4 from CSE2's Fall 2013 semester. So this homework consists of 5 different tasks, which all test a student's ability to use selection statements, comparison operators, and Boolean expressions, in particular to regulate user input and solve problems.
The task is to write a program that prompts the user to enter an integer and print a message stating the number is 0, positive, an even or odd, or negative, an even or odd. If the value entered is not an integer, the program must print non-integer entered. We need to save this program as integer.java. So here there are 2 sample runs where the user enters -5, which returns that 5 is a negative odd integer. And then there is another run where the user enters pi, and the program returns that pi is not an integer. So to approach this problem, we are basically going to hash out what we need to do. Overall, it's basically taking a number and checking if it's 0, negative, or positive. And if it's not 0, then if the number is even or odd. We also need to make sure that the user can enter only integers. Alright, so let's get started.
So first we need to import the scanner, create the class and the main method, all of which I have done here already. Then we need to create a scanner object, and in this particular case we're calling it scan. Then the first thing we need to do is prompt the user to enter an integer value, and we're going to do this using a system.out.print statement. After that, we need to accept the user's input. However, we also need to ensure the user enters correct input, which means the user should only be able to enter positive, negative integers. We're going to do this using an if-else statement using has.nextInt to control whether the user enters an int or not. The scan.hasNextInt will return a true or false statement. Then, if it is true, it will go to the if statement, and the program continues. However, if it doesn't do that, and it returns a false, then it goes into the else statement, and in the else statement, we need to print an error message saying that whatever the user has entered is not an integer. So we assign whatever the user has entered to a variable named string, and then we're using a println statement that says whatever the user entered is not an integer. So then we have a return here, which exits the program. So now inside the if statement, we need to accept user input. So we have an int called integer, which accepts the user's input. And then there's a very particular reason that I'm using the scan.nextInt to accept the user input inside the if-else statement rather than outside of it. And this is because if I accept user input outside the if-else statement, this will read user input twice, and the user will have to enter their input twice. I will go into this topic further later and show exactly what it does when I discuss the common errors with these types of questions, but for now we'll continue with this problem. So after accepting user input, we'll need to assess it. So the first thing we need to assess is if the number is 0, positive, or negative. For this, we create 3 if and else if statements. So here we have an if statement that checks if it's 0, then 2 else if statements that check if an integer is greater than 0, so check if it's positive, and then a else statement that checks if it's less than 0, so it checks if it is negative. So now we need to work on the parts inside the if/else if statements. So for the first one, when the integer is 0, we don't need to check if the input is odd or even because it's just 0. So in this case, we'll insert a println statement that just says you entered 0. But with the other 2 else if statements, we need to check both to see if the integer is odd or even, and we do this by using a mod. So if the number is evenly divisible by 2, there is no remainder. Therefore, the equation integer mod 2 should be equal to 0. And if it's not, then we have an else statement for that. And so that is basically checking if it's even, where it goes into the if statement, or if it's odd. So then we need to basically inform the user like what their number is. So we're just going to enter some system.out.println statements here. So we have 4 of them that the program can go into. So it just says integer, which is the variable, is negative, positive, odd, or even. And that's basically it. So now we're going to compile this really quick just to show you that it works. So here we have the terminal, so cd, and then javac integer.java, then java integer. So we're going to enter whatever test runs we did that were shown in the homework. So -5 is the first one. So -5 is a negative odd integer, which is true. So we're going to run it again, and we're going to enter pi this time. And pi is not an integer, which is also true. So that is all. So we have the next program that we need to write, and the prompt is to write a program that prompts the user to enter a word or a phrase and prints out the sum of all vowels positions in the alphabet. The letter positions in the alphabet are A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, etc. For this exercise, there are only 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, U. So we need to save this program in alphaslums.java. Underneath, we have 2 sample runs in which the user enters Java rocks, which returns that the sum of all vowel positions is 17. And then we have another run in which the user enters mountain hawks, and that returns the result that the sum of all vowels positions is 47. So overall, basically, the program needs to read down the string that the user enters and check each part of the string to see if it is a vowel. Then if it is, it needs to be able to sum it up depending on which vowel it is. And then it needs to print this for the user to see. So let's get started. So first we need to import the scanner, create the class and the main method, then declare the scanner, which I have already done here. In this case, the scanner is called scan. Next, we need to prompt the user to enter a word or a phrase, and we will do this with a simple print statement that just says, enter a word or a phrase. Then we need to accept user input, and we're going to do this by assigning user input to a string variable, which we're calling word. So word equals scan.nextLine. Just special attention to the fact that we're using next line here instead of next. Next line will accept an entire string with spaces and all. Next will only accept like what is up till the space. So if you type in woot space woot, it will only take the first woot instead of both. So that's why we're using .next line. And then after that, we're declaring a int variable, which basically we're going to use to keep track of the sum of the vowel positions. And now we're going to use a combination of a for loop and char to read each character in the string going down the entire string. So here we have a for loop, basically, and it goes down the entire length, hence word.length, parentheses. And now we're creating a char variable, which we're assigning to, it's called check, and we're assigning it to the character at I. So each time the loop runs, it changes the position that the char at is checking. So it runs down the entire length of the string. So it's word.char since our user input is stored in Word. So then after that, we're basically going to have a bunch of if statements that checks if the character at that location is a vowel or not. So it needs to check if it's capital or lowercase. So that's why we have an or operator in the middle. And then basically we have a addition to count at that point. Next, we're going to have a bunch more of these statements. So we have A, E, I, or U. And each of the values changes for each position because each of the positions is different for each letter. So for E, we have 5, I, we have 9, and O, we have 15, and U, we have 21. So then lastly, we'll have an else statement, which will work if it's not a vowel. So it just tells the loop to continue on. And then lastly, we need to display the vowel count to the user. So then we're going to have a println statement right here that does that. So basically, the sum of all vowels positions is equal to count. And that's it. So now we're just going to compile this real quick. So cd ec, which is the folder we're going into, and then we're going to do javac alpha sums.java. It compiles java alpha sums. So we're going to just enter whatever was in the example runs in the homework. So java rocks, exclamation point, and that output is true. So then the next run that we had was mountain hawks, and that is also true. So it compiles and runs. So now we have the third program that we need to write. So we basically need to write a program that prompts the user to enter an outside temperature and whether it is in Celsius or Fahrenheit. If the user enters the temperature in Celsius, then display the temperature in Fahrenheit. And if the user enters a temperature in Fahrenheit, then display the temperature in Celsius. If the user enters an invalid entry, print invalid entry. Save your program in tempconversion.java. So here he gives us two conversion formulas that we need to use within the program, and then there are two sample runs where the temperature entered is 37 degrees Celsius, and the program returns that it is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the next run, the user enters 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and that returns that it is 37 degrees Celsius. So overall, basically what we need to do with this program is make sure the user enters valid input. Then depending on if the user enters C or F, the program needs to convert the user's input from Celsius to Fahrenheit, or the other way around, and then we need to display it. So let's get started. So first we need to import the scanner, create the class, the main method, and then declare the scanner, which I have already done here. In this case, the scanner is called scan. Then we're going to prompt the user to enter the current temperature, and we're doing this with a basic print statement. Then after that, we need to make sure that the user enters a double. So here we're going to have an if-else statement set with the if statement using .has next double to check if the input is a double. If not, it'll go to the else statement, which will inform the user that their input is invalid with a print statement. And then there will be a return which exits the program. So now inside the if statement, we're accepting user input and assigning it to a double variable called temp. And then after that, we need to prompt the user for if they enter the input previously entered in Celsius or Fahrenheit, which we'll do with another print statement, which basically just asks if Celsius or Fahrenheit. So now we're going to accept user input and assign it to a string variable called CF, but we also need to make sure the user can only enter lower or uppercase C or F. So we're basically going to have an if statement, an else if statement, and an else statement, so that if the user enters anything besides upper or lowercase C or F, the program will go to the else statement, which tells the user they did not enter valid input, and it will exit the program. So now we're going to put stuff inside the if and the else if statements, and basically we're going to put equations in here. So in C, we're going to create an equation for converting Celsius to Fahrenheit, and we're going to assign it to the double F. So we're multiplying 9/5, which we're casting as double, hence the double in front of the 9 and the 5, plus 32 times temp. And now we're going to work inside the else if statement for if the user enters a Fahrenheit value, and we're going to create a double variable which is equal to the calculated value of converting Fahrenheit to Celsius, which we're doing by subtracting 32 from temp and then multiplying it times 5/9, which we've again cast as a double, hence the double in front of the 5 and the 9. And then we need to inform the user as to what the converted values are. So we're going to have a couple system.out.println statements, and we're going to use math round in these statements because some of these calculated values lead to some messy decimals. So we want nice, clean, single decimal numbers. So we're just going to use math.round and multiply the calculated values times 100 and then divide it by 100.0. And that is all we need to do. Okay, so now we're ready to compile this. So we're just going to open up the terminal, and then we're going to do cd go into the right folder, and then javac temp conversion.java, java temp conversion, and now we're going to enter whatever we entered in the trial runs in the homework, so 37, and this was in Celsius, so C, and that returns that the Fahrenheit value is 98.6, which is correct. And now we're going to run it again to convert back. So we're going to put in 98.6 for the temperature value, and then this is going to be Fahrenheit, and it returns that the temperature in Celsius is 37 degrees, which is also correct. So the program compiles and runs. So now we have a fourth program that we need to do, and for this program we need to write a program that prompts the user for a US dollar amount and a comparison year in the 2000s and print the equivalent buying power number of the entered amount in the entered year. If the user enters a year outside the range 2000 to 2013, print year out of range. Any other invalid entry should result in invalid entry. Save this program in buyingpower.java. So underneath the instructions, there is a bunch of CPI values that we need to use in the program. And then there's also a sample run where the user inputs $15.79 in the year 2005, and the program outputs $15.79 today, had a buying power of $13.26 in 2005. So overall, basically, we need to ensure that the user enters correct input, and then the program needs to calculate the value in the specified year, which the user specifies. Alright, so let's get started. So first we need to import the scanner, create the class and the main method, and then declare the scanner, which I have already done here. In this case, the scanner is called scan. So then we need to prompt the user for input, and we're just going to use a print statement saying enter a dollar amount, so that the user enters a dollar amount. Then we need to make sure the user enters a double for the input. So here we have an if-else statement with the if statement using .hasNext double, which checks if the input is a double. If it's not, it'll go to the else statement, which will inform the user that the input is invalid. And then there's a return which exits the program. So next we need to accept user input and to a double value called $. And then after that, we also need to make sure that the user cannot enter negative values. So we're going to have an if statement where if the dollar value is less than 0, the program prints, please enter a positive value, and then there's a return statement which exits the program. So then after that, we need to make sure we need to prompt the user to enter a year number, and we're just going to do this with a print statement. So please enter a year from 2000 to 2013. We need to make sure that the user enters an int value. So we're going to put it in an if-else statement with .hasNext int, and if the user does not enter an int, it goes to the else statement, which says invalid input, and it'll return. So then after that, we need to accept user input, and we're going to do that with an int variable called year, and then we're also going to create a CPI value which will change later according to what year the user has entered. We must also ensure that the user enters a year between 2000 and 2013 inclusive, so we're using an if statement for that. And then there's also an else statement where if the user does not enter a year within the range, it states that the year is not in the range and exits the program. Then we're going to use a switch statement to change the value of the variable CPI according to what year is entered. So basically this will help us calculate it later. So if the user enters 2013, the CPI is 1, and so on and so forth. And then after that, after the CPI variable is changed, we're going to calculate the value of the user's entry with the year asked. So that's just basically dollar times CPI. And then we're going to have a println statement that basically shows the user what the new value is after the year asked. What we need to do with this, though, is sometimes there might be decimals calculated with calculating the new dollar value, so we need to use math.round. And yeah, that's it. So now we're just going to compile this program, and we're going to open up a terminal. We're going to go into the correct folder, and then javac buying power.java. It compiled Java buying power. So we're just going to enter whatever the whatever was specified in the sample run in the homework or in the instructions. So 1579 in 2005, and yep, that is correct. So the program compiles and runs. So now we're on to the fifth program. In this program, we must write a program that prompts the user to enter a circle's radius and degree value, which must be from 0 to 360 degrees. And then we need to print the perimeter, the area of the circle, as well as the perimeter and area of the shape that's left of the circle when a wedge of the specified number of degrees is removed. Results should be to 3 significant digits. Invalid entries should result in a statement invalid entry. So underneath there is a sample run where the user enters 5 for the radius value and 90 degrees, and then the program returns a bunch of values for the calculated numbers. So overall, we basically need to ensure that the user enters correct input, and then the program needs to be able to calculate the perimeter and the area with the specified radius, and then the perimeter and the area of a circle after the wedge of a specified degrees has been removed. Alright, so let's get started. So first we need to import the scanner, create the class and the main method, and then declare the scanner, which I have already done here. In this case, the scanner is called scan. Then we need to prompt the user to enter a radius value, and we're going to use a print statement for this. Then we need to make sure the user enters a double. So here we have an if-else statement with the if statement using .has next double, which checks if the input is double, and if it's not, it'll go to the else statement, which will inform the user that their input is invalid with a println statement, which states you did not enter valid input, and then there's return, which basically exits the program. So then after that, we're going to accept the input using .next double and assign that input to a double variable called radius. And then we also need to make sure that that radius value is not less than 0. So we're going to insert an if statement here that prints, please enter a positive value, and exits the program if the user enters a negative number. So then after that, we need to prompt the user to enter a degree value with a print statement, which just says enter a degree value. And then we need to ensure that they enter a double. So again, with the if-else statement with the has next double, and the else statement that says invalid input if the user does not enter a double, and then it'll exit the program because it has a return statement. Then we're going to accept the user's input in a double variable called degree, and we need to make sure that the degree value entered is greater than 0 and less than 360 degrees. So we're going to have an if statement for that using an or operator in the middle, so that if there is a number that is not within range that the user enters, the program will print invalid entry and exit the program with the return statement. And then after that, we need to create variables which will be altered later on depending on what the user has entered. So here we have the perimeter, area, wedge, and remain. So now we have a bunch of if statements here. Basically, these if statements are redefining the variables that we defined above. The reason I did this is because most values can be calculated using these formulas up here, right here. However, in the case that degree equals 0 or degree equals 360 degrees, you cannot calculate the necessary values using these formulas over here. So I have two special cases underneath here for those two. So for the first set of formulas, to calculate perimeter, I multiplied 2 times pi in radius. To calculate area, I multiplied pi times radius squared. And to calculate the perimeter of the circle without the wedge, I calculated the perimeter of the wedge minus the 2 straight sides that wedges have. Then I subtracted it from the perimeter and added 2 new sides that would be created with the removal of a wedge. And lastly, to calculate the area of a circle without the wedge, I subtracted the area of the wedge from the overall area of the circle. And in these 2 special cases where degree equals 0, the last 2 values were what changed mostly, and with the degree removed being 0, it was just the wedge removed would have no effect. So the wedge just equals perimeter, and then the remain just equals area. And with degree equals 360 degrees, you're removing pretty much the entire circle at that point. So wedge and remainder is left defined as 0. So then after that, we just need a couple println statements, basically telling the user what the results are of the program. In this case, we really needed to use math.round because a lot of these values up here calculated resulted in long decimals, and therefore we need to round these down to 3 significant figures. And so that is it. So now we just need to compile this program. So we're going to go to the right folder, javac radius.java. Then we'll have java radius. And we're just going to enter the values given in the example. So the radius value given was 5. The degree value given was 90. So the perimeter of the circle with radii 5 is 31.4. The area of the circle is 70.5. The perimeter of the shape after removing a 90-degree wedge is 33.6. And the area of the shape after removing the wedge of 90 degrees is 58.9, which is all correct. So the program is compiled and it runs. Alright, so now we're going to go over some common errors and misconceptions with using selection statements and Boolean operators and questions like the ones I just explained. So during my explanation for part 1 of this homework question, I mentioned what happens when you accept user input outside of an if statement that uses .has next blank, and why you need to have it inside the if statement. So now I'm going to show you and basically explain what happens when you put it outside versus inside. So over here we have the first program that we wrote, and right now it accepts user input inside the if statement. So now it just basically, you've seen it run, it asks for it once and uses that input. But if we take it and we put it outside, what ends up happening when we run it is that I'll ask the user for input twice. So now we're going to compile it, integer.java, and then java integer. So now we're going to enter 5, and look, it doesn't take in the value yet, but now we're going to enter 7. So basically what ends up happening is that the first time around with this statement over here, it basically accepts user input. So it makes integer whatever scan.nextInt is, but then over here it prompts the user again for input. However, so basically that's why you end up prompting the user twice, but if you put it inside it, it prompts it just once and then assigns that value after the user has been prompting to integer. So that is why you should put that inside the if statement. That was a common misconception I had when I was working with these programs and working on the homework, so I thought I'd just share that. And then the biggest misconceptions with these questions is just misreading the actual question itself. It sounds very simple, but honestly it's the biggest thing that has affected me personally. And basically, my advice for you, if you're ever faced with this type of question, is to read it carefully and hash out the plan of action first, as I did with all the questions above, which is why I read the questions aloud and worked out a verbal plan in my head before actually doing the questions. If these questions that I just worked with you on were on the exam, one question I would definitely have messed up would be the radius program. So if you remember, the radius program was basically that you had to calculate the radius, the perimeter and the area of a circle after the user inputs a radius, and then also you had to calculate the area and perimeter of a circle after a wedge has been removed and the degrees of the wedge is specified by the user. So initially when I was doing the program, I actually misread it and I thought I had to calculate the area of the wedge, area and the perimeter of the wedge that the user specified, not the area and perimeter of the circle with the wedge removed. So I honestly would not have checked it twice on an exam, and I wouldn't have even tried to calculate potential outputs because I didn't have a calculator in the exam, and these numbers that we would be working with weren't exactly clean. So in this case, like, reading carefully really could have helped me. Furthermore, regarding these types of questions on tests, the best way to prepare for these questions is to just read carefully and understand the overall concepts of selection statements, comparison operators, and Boolean statements. And then you have to be able to apply these concepts on the test. And to help with that ability to apply these concepts, I really recommend doing a lot of like practice problems for maybe the textbook and like the exams online and stuff. And I'm going to do one more variation of this type of question that you might actually find on an exam because this question was actually on an exam. Alright, so here we have the extra question that I'm explaining that might actually be on an exam. This is from an actual exam. This is from the 2014 Spring Exam 1 for CSE 2. So below, or basically it says, below, write convert.java, a Java program that prompts the user for one of the only following non-negative integers: 0, 1, 10, 11, 100, 101, 110, or 111. Your program should print out what the value of the integer entered would be if it were interpreted as a binary number. For example, if 11 is entered, 3 would be displayed. Your program should also indicate when an inappropriate integer is entered. Assume that the user always inputs an integer. Alright, so here basically it provides us with the main method. It imports the scanner and the class. So here I've written the program already, and I'm just going to explain it to you step by step as to my logic in solving this program. Okay, so first you basically want to create the scanner object and declare it. So in this case it's called scan. And then you want to prompt the user. So here we're prompting the user to enter one of these numbers over here. And then normally I would have an if scan.hasNext in here, but since the question specifically stated that we have to assume that the user always inputs an integer, we don't need that. So instead, I basically have nothing there. And then after that, I have an if statement. So if it equals any of the numbers stated above, it goes into this if statement. But underneath that if statement, I have an else statement for if the user enters something besides those numbers. So at that point, it prints out you did not enter one of those numbers, and then I have a return to exit the program. But inside the if statement, I have an int called binary, which is basically like a value. And with this switch statement, I reassign the value for binary depending on what the user has entered. So a switch statement with int, which is what the user has entered. So in the case that they entered 0, binary will equal 0, and then so on and so forth. The biggest thing with using a switch statement is to remember breaks. Don't forget breaks, otherwise you'll have a fall through, and then the output won't be exactly what you thought it was. And then after that, binary has been reassigned to whatever value is, so we just print out binary. I have your number in decimals is binary, but I feel like in this question, you'd be fine just printing the actual variable itself. So it would just be this. So I'm just going to compile it and show you how it runs. So now we're just going to compile this really quick, and then we're going to run it. So we're going to enter 1 for the first run, so that's just 1. We can enter 100 this time. That is indeed 4. We can enter 101, which would be 5. 111, which would be 7. So yes, this program compiles and runs. So again, this is Deepshika DOS, and this is CSE2.